Support for Central Florida Public Media comes from the UCF College of Business, offering the new online space MBA. Designed for professionals in innovative and high-growth industries, beginning spring 2026, students gain advanced business skills through the lens of the space economy. Learn more at business.ucf.edu/space MBA.
Starliner's next move and a deep dive into the Gemini program. You're listening to Are We There Yet?, the radio show exploring space exploration. Hi, I'm Brendan Byrne. After last year's Starliner crewed mission, which returned without a crew, Boeing's human spacecraft will fly again, but without people on board. NASA has reviewed its contract with the space company, which includes a third uncrewed test flight. We'll speak with Ars Technica's Eric Berger about Starliner's future, plus a look at some of the most recent space news stories. Then, before Apollo took humans to the moon, there was the Gemini program. The program was crucial in helping humans land on the moon, mastering key things like docking and rendezvous. We'll speak with author Jeffrey Kluger about his new book, Gemini, Stepping Stone to the Moon, The Untold Story, that dives deep into the program's contributions to the moon landings. That's ahead on Are We There Yet? Starliner's last flight was back in September of 2024, returning back to Earth without its crew, after issues prompted NASA to return the crew home on SpaceX's Dragon capsule instead. Now, Boeing's Starliner could fly no earlier than April of 2026, but with some changes. Originally, Starliner was supposed to have 6 crewed missions, but now NASA's reduced that number to 4, and its next mission will carry no astronauts. So why the change? Plus, what else is happening in the world of space? Here to answer those questions and take a look deeper at Starliner's past and its possible future is Eric Berger, the senior space editor at Ars Technica. Eric, welcome back to Are We There Yet?
Thank you.
So NASA has amended the contract it has between itself and Boeing and cuts the number of Starliner flights down from the original 6. Eric, was this at all a surprise to you?
No, it really wasn't a surprise because the fact of the matter is that time is running out for Starliner to make a meaningful impact on the space station with the end of life for the space station now in 2030. You figured that at most Starliner was going to fly one crewed mission a year. SpaceX would fly the other one. And so, if they're not operational until next year, that's already fewer than 6 missions. So we expected this to come, and we'd kind of been waiting to hear that they were going to fly the next mission cargo only, and it's another test flight. So NASA just kind of finally, said in formally what we kind of expected to see happen.
Mm-hmm. Walk us back, Eric. How did we get to this point with Starliner?
Boy, I go all the way back to 2019 when they flew their first test flight with Starliner. Right after launch, they had some software problems, almost lost the vehicle about 10 minutes after launch, and then had more software problems with some of the thrusters right before re-entry into Earth's atmosphere at the end of the mission. So it never docked with station. They almost lost it twice, and it was a really not a good thing. They came back a few years later and did another test flight. It was more successful, but they had some thruster issues. NASA spent almost 2 years reviewing that before clearing them to fly the first crewed mission in the summer of 2024. This was with Butch Wilmore and Sonny Williams. We kind of all probably remember that whole adventure. But they had a pretty sporty flight up to the station. NASA decided that the performance issues with the thrusters was concerning enough that they were going to have that vehicle come back empty. And Butch and Sonny ultimately came back on a Crew Dragon spacecraft. And so we'd kind of been waiting to see what the next step would be. And finally, we found out that NASA and Boeing were going to continue, but that the next Starliner mission would fly cargo to the space station. So it's essentially the third uncrewed test flight of Starliner.
And that not coming until April of 2026, earlier then, right?
That's a no earlier than date, yeah. And I think NASA in its release said that they have a fair amount of work to do before then. So I would write that date in pencil rather than pen. And then I think you would push out for a few months from there because there's only certain windows that Starliner could come to the space station because of other vehicles, principally Crew Dragons, occupying those ports.
So we don't know specifically why it's taking so long, but we can infer that there's a lot that needs to be done, right?
Well, we can have a pretty good idea. NASA was not really specific about what they found with the thruster issues on Starliner, and frankly, they have not put up a news conference about this in more than a year, I would say. But we can infer that NASA and Boeing have done a lot of testing of the thrusters on Starliner service module to try to replicate the failure that's now been observed in 2 flights, to understand it and then put in measures to fix that. We just don't know the specifics of what those are. NASA said it has testing ongoing. So like I said, I think that there's still a fair amount of work to do before the April launch date.
Do we know what rocket that will be? These previous Starliners have flown on ULA's Atlas V. The company is sunsetting that rocket. Is there a chance that we may run out of Atlas Vs?
No, because ULA, United Launch Alliance, had booked with Boeing for the uncrewed flights and then for the 6 crewed missions. And so they have a stockpile of Atlas Vs. I think ULA is planning to fly Atlas Vs through the end of the decade for Starliner regardless. So I don't think this changes anything. And they have not tried to certify Starliner on any other rocket at this point.
Gotcha. Thinking back to when the commercial crew contracts were awarded, Boeing was the front runner, was supposed to be the heavy hitter, and it has not been. It's fallen quite behind SpaceX, which was the underdog back when those contracts were awarded. What happened?
Man, it's been 11 years since then. Yeah. I think there's a couple of things. First of all, I think Boeing really struggled with the fixed price environment for Starliner. It had previously, basically the government had paid it for all of its expenses plus a fee, and now it was being asked to bid a certain amount of money, $4.2 billion. And then, if there were costs beyond that, and there have been to the tune of a couple billion, Boeing was on the hook for them. So they've lost money on the program. So I think dealing with fixed price and sort of prioritizing engineering time and other time for Starliner was a real problem for them. And then they had the whole 737 issue, so the company had to surge a lot of resources into that. So I would say that maybe the company's best engineers were working on other projects. Also, I think, NASA had some requirement bloat. And one thing SpaceX is good at is when NASA comes to them with a bunch of requirements, like you've got to have this much storage space, or the lockers have to open this way, or you've got to have this level of temperature, or just whatever. Like there are thousands of these requirements that are levied. SpaceX is pretty aggressive at pushing back on those. And I think Boeing had in the past was used to sort of the customer's always right mentality. And so they struggle with that. And then technically, they've really had issues with propulsion on the vehicle. There have been tension between Boeing and its propulsion provider, Aerojet, and that's been an uneasy relationship, I would say. And so they started across a number of fronts to really bring this project to fruition.
You're listening to Are We There Yet?, the radio show exploring space exploration. I'm Brendan Byrne. We're speaking with Eric Berger, the senior space editor with Ars Technica, about Boeing's Starliner and how it could once again fly in 2026. How does this affect Boeing's future in the aerospace industry?
Boeing has 3 major civil space areas right now. One is they have the contract to operate the International Space Station. That obviously is coming to an end in 2030-ish. They have the core stage contract for the Space Launch System rocket, as well as the exploration upper stage on the SLS rocket. There's a lot of momentum, I think, in the White House to cancel the exploration upper stage. There's some battling right now with Congress, although it looks like the SLS is going to fly maybe 5 flights at most and then be sunsetted. And so that big rocket program, looks to have a finite future again, sort of ending in the early 2030s. And then you've got obviously the Starliner situation. It's not clear there's going to be much of a market for Starliner after the International Space Station was retired, because it will be competing directly on price with Crew Dragon, and it's probably not going to be able to do so favorably. So it's a real question about how committed Boeing is to its space system. I think they're going to sort of stay in the satellite manufacturing business, which they do a lot of activity. But again, they're being pressured there, not just by SpaceX, but by K2 and other sort of entrants to trying to bring more of a new space attitude to satellite production. So they're under a lot of pressure.
I want to change gears a bit here, Eric, and talk about SpaceX's Starship, which had a mishap during testing. What do we know about this?
It would be great if Starships could stop blowing up. What happened was that SpaceX rolled out the essentially first stage of this called the V3 of its Starship rocket. The first stage, and importantly, there were not engines attached to it yet. So this was just mostly pressure testing. And they rolled it out one day, they started testing that night, and by I think it was 4:00 the next morning, the stage had popped. It basically unzippered. It's not entirely clear why it happened. It was likely during some pressurization testing. The vehicle was a loss. So they lost the first stage, and it's disappointing because, this late into a development program, you really don't want to be losing stages during pressure testing. I guess the upside is that SpaceX is hardware rich. They vowed to sort of understand the problem and have the next vehicle on the test stand later this month in December. So they'll overcome it. It's not debilitating, but it is, as I say, it's a little concerning that they continue to have these vehicles blow up, several years down the line in a program like this.
And it comes at a time when SpaceX is under the microscope for not having Starship ready in time, right?
Absolutely. I mean, I think you're losing, this is just another month or two lost in the build up to the human landing system for NASA's Artemis program, which already faces a lot of schedule pressure. So not good from that respect either.
Eric, looking at the Russian space program, there was a pretty serious incident at their launch facility. Bring us up to speed on that.
Yeah, so on Thanksgiving morning, they did a crew launch of the Soyuz vehicle. There was one NASA astronaut on board with two Russians, and the launch was fine, but someone forgot to secure this about 20-ton launch platform beneath the rocket. So as the vehicle took off and lifted off, this platform was shoved out from underneath the launch pad down into the flame trench, and this caused a lot of damage to Site 31 at Baikonur Cosmodrome in Kazakhstan. Now, Russia has a lot of different launch pads. The problem is that this is the only one right now currently set up to launch Progress vehicles. These are the cargo ships for the space station, and Soyuz spacecraft crewed vehicles. So essentially, while that pad is down for the time being, at least, they have no way to launch crew and cargo missions to the space station.
It's also would be concerning that there is only one crew transportation vehicle operational now, right? Which is SpaceX's Crew Dragon, correct?
It is Crew Dragon. That's the only vehicle, if you needed to launch today, that could get to the space station. Falcon 9 launches the only cargo vehicles, Dragon and Cygnus. So no pressure, SpaceX. But yeah, the space station is highly reliant on the Dragon and Falcon rocket.
And is there any indication on when that pad might be fixed, or they may be able to convert another pad to launch Soyuz?
Well, there's been a lot of bluster from Russians about how they're going to fix the problem soon, but I think the devil's in the details. And the people I talk to who I trust in this stuff say it's a pretty serious issue that's going to take some time to work out.
And finally, Eric, on Wednesday, the Trump administration's nominee for NASA Administrator, Jarek Eisenman, is expected to appear before the Senate. What will you be listening for?
My understanding is that most of the senators said they didn't need another confirmation hearing with Eisenman, who, of course, had one last spring after he was nominated the first time, and it went reasonably well. He was going to be confirmed by the Senate by a vote of about 70-30, I think was a good estimate. So most of the senators on the committee know Jared Isaacman, like him, but Ted Cruz, or at least some of his staffers, really wanted to have a second hearing. So what I'm going to be watching for is whether there's any tension between Cruz and Isaacman. Because Cruz has designs to have a lot of influence over how NASA's run. Texas Senator, obviously. Isaacman has a little bit of a different vision for the space agency. So I expect it to be cordial, but I'll be on the lookout for any fireworks between Cruz and Isaacman.
And knowing what we know about Isaacman and what he has said in the previous confirmation hearing and what he said since, if he does get confirmed, which it is likely, what would those first days of an Isaacman administration look like?
I think it would be a very energetic administration. He has a plan where he's mapped out like what he will do during the first hours of his administration to try to get NASA moving more quickly across a number of fronts. So I think you'll see a lot of action, a lot of urgency, reviewing current plans, trying to make sure that everything is on track and, with Artemis 2 and looking ahead to other Artemis missions and then across the broad portfolio of NASA. I mean, his mandate will be to get things done, and he will bring a kind of a pro-commercial space focus to the agency. But I think in contrast to what we saw with like the outset of the Bill Nelson administration, I think you'll see very energetic, lot of activity. He's had a year to think about this now, so I expect he has a lot of plans he's going to want to implement pretty quickly.
We've been speaking with Eric Berger, the senior space editor at Ars Technica. Eric, always great to have you.
My pleasure.
Still to come, a look at the critical space program before the Apollo missions.
Every time astronauts venture out for an EVA, a spacewalk, it's another tip of the hat to Gemini, where we learned how to do that.
How Gemini helped get Apollo to the moon. That's ahead on Are We There Yet?
Support for Central Florida Public Media comes from the UCF College of Business, offering the new online space MBA. Designed for professionals in innovative and high-growth industries, beginning spring 2026, students gain advanced business skills through the lens of the space economy. Learn more at business.ucf.edu/space MBA.
You're listening to Are We There Yet?, the radio show exploring space exploration from Central Florida Public Media. I'm Brendan Byrne. Could there be lightning on Mars? NASA's Perseverance rover may have observed what scientists believe could be lightning on the red planet. We'll take a look at Earth's neighbor and its weather next week on Are We There Yet? But for now, we are talking about the critical space program that came after NASA's Mercury program and before Apollo. Whether you call it Gemini or Gemini, it means the same thing. The program that lifted Apollo up and onto the moon. And yes, we'll get to the controversy over how to pronounce it in a minute. But without the program, Apollo may not have ever been able to complete crucial tasks like docking and rendezvous, which were needed to get astronauts to the moon. The program did capture the attention of the public, but not as much as the Mercury programs or the Apollo programs. In his new book, Gemini, Stepping Stone to the Moon, The Untold Story, author and editor-at-large with Time magazine Jeffrey Kluger looks at Gemini's contributions and brings that program back into the public spotlight. Here to talk more about his book and what he hopes readers will take away is Jeffrey Kluger. Jeffrey, welcome to Are We There Yet?
Thank you for having me. It's a pleasure.
Hey, before we get started, the question that needs to be answered, Gemini or Gemini, how do you pronounce it?
The pronunciation before the program started was, of course, universally Gemini. People at NASA didn't have much truck with astrology back then, so a lot of them simply didn't know the word, weren't familiar with the word, and thus began pronouncing it Gemini. Ultimately, the confusion was such that NASA actually issued a statement to the New York Times crediting their naming committee, which, by the way, doesn't really exist, with establishing the pronunciation as Gemini.
Let's talk about the book. Why now? Why did you come up with this book now? We're decades away from the Gemini program. Why release it in 2025?
Well, for a few reasons. First of all, the story had not really been told before now. The Right Stuff told the story of the Mercury program, and it will be another century before anybody tries to write another Mercury book. Tom Wolfe just planted his flag in that turf, and it will be his throughout eternity. I and other people have written extensively about the Apollo program, but Gemini remained the sort of overlooked middle sibling of those three. It wasn't the program in which we sent astronauts into space for the first time, so it didn't have that news-making hook. But what it had was being the proving ground for virtually everything we've done in space since. And that's the reason that I wanted to tell the story now. Every time a Crew Dragon SpaceX capsule docks with the International Space Station, it is a tribute to the rendezvous and docking work done in Gemini. Every time astronauts venture out for an EVA, a spacewalk, it's another tip of the hat to Gemini, where we learned how to do that. Every time astronauts, cosmonauts, and taikonauts spend more than 2 weeks in space, it's again ode to the fortnight Jim Lovell and Frank Borman spent aloft on Gemini 7 in December of 1965. So I think, the need for the thank you, the need for the acknowledgement, the need for the recognition of Gemini has been with us since the 60s. And it seemed like a good time to fill that historical gap.
As you just mentioned, there were so many firsts that were so crucial to future space missions, Apollo, and even current missions when we're docking our astronauts to the International Space Station. I want to talk a bit about some of those missions that you've extensively researched for this book. You alluded to the 14-day mission. Gemini, was that Gemini 7?
Gemini 7, yeah.
Gemini 7. Talk about that. That was such an important mission in terms of long-term living in space, but it was not very comfortable for those two astronauts, was it?
They basically were side by side, shoulder to shoulder, in a space no bigger than the front seat of a 1960s Volkswagen Beetle. And they were there for 2 weeks without moving. The astronauts learned in the Gemini simulators back at Canaveral and in Houston that the space was so small and so cramped, you could straighten your legs, you could stretch your legs, but you had to bend your back to do it. And you could stretch your back, but you had to tuck in your legs to do it. All of their, without getting into too much information here, all of their bodily functions were performed in front of the man sitting a handful of inches from them. So certainly whatever dignity the astronauts had before they went aloft was quickly deprived of it. In 2019, I was in the restoration lab at the Smithsonian Air and Space Museum, and they were restoring the left-hand hatch of Gemini 7, the side that Frank Borman was on. The hatch closed over their heads, and in the cloth insulation of the inside of the hatch, you could see a place that had been rubbed raw by Frank Borman's head brushing up against it for 2 weeks. So that was a real indication, or just a real reminder of how cramped those conditions were.
We're speaking with Jeffrey Kluger. He's the editor-at-large with Time Magazine, and his new book is Gemini, Stepping Stone to the Moon, The Untold Story. Jeffrey, another important mission of the Gemini program was Gemini 8, which I know got a nod in one of the recent films, First Man, just because of how harrowing it is. But tell me a bit about just how dangerous that mission was, but also how important it was for those future lunar missions.
Getting two vehicles in the same vicinity, in the same orbit, within a few feet of each other, is a monumentally difficult job. Business of rendezvous and docking in space involves physics that are just completely upside down. You would think if you have two spacecraft in the same orbit, one trailing the other one by, say, 10 kilometers, and you wanted to bring them together, it would be a simple matter of the trailing vehicle to hit its thrusters, speed up a little bit, and catch up with the vehicle 10 kilometers ahead of it. That's the way it would work on Earth in a 1G gravity environment. In orbit, it's very different. If you try to accelerate, all that does is lift you into a higher orbit, which takes you even further from the ship you're pursuing. If the lead ship tries to slow down to let the following ship catch up with it, it just drops into a lower orbit, which equally takes the ships out of the spacecraft out of one another's vicinity. In order to bring them together, you have to fire your engines on one side of the planet, and by the time you get to the other side, you will have begun at last to catch up. Then it's a matter of slowly tweaking your thrusters to reach the other ship that's in front of you. So that was the business of rendezvous. Docking, when the nose of one vehicle would lock into the docking port of another vehicle, was essential for lunar landings, because we had a lunar module and we had a command module, and the lunar module would separate from the command module, go down to the surface. The ascent stage of the lunar module would then take off when the crew was done and meet up with the command module in orbit. So we had to learn how to do that. It had never been done before until Gemini 8 flew. And NASA launched something called an Agena target vehicle, which was a 26-foot long tube with an engine at one end and a docking port at the other end. And the astronauts would meet up with it in orbit, insert the nose of the spacecraft into the docking port of the Agena, and then hit a lock system that clamped the two vehicles together and essentially turned them into one vehicle. So Neil Armstrong, first man on the moon, was the first man to accomplish docking in orbit for either the US or the Soviet Union. And he and his co-pilot, Dave Scott, had docked within the first couple of hours of getting to orbit. Within minutes of doing so, they noticed there's spacecraft going into a slow roll, and the roll was about one revolution every 10 or 15 seconds, but it sped up to 2 revolutions every 10 or 15 seconds, and 3 revolutions every 10 or 15 seconds, until they were going 60 revolutions per minute. At that speed, the astronauts could easily slip into vertigo, and they began to slip into vertigo. And had they passed out and lost consciousness, it would have been the end of the mission. It also would have been the end of the astronauts, because the G-forces would have torn the two spacecraft apart. Armstrong managed to disconnect from the Agena and slowly firing his thrusters bring the spacecraft to heel. But that mission, which was supposed to last 3 days, and Dave Scott was supposed to take a 90-minute spacewalk, which would effectively mean he was outside of the capsule for an entire orbit of the Earth. All of that had to be scrubbed, and the crew was brought home after just 10 hours. So rendezvous and docking was achieved, but we almost lost the crew in the process.
As this book outlines, I mean, there was such important work being done in the Gemini program. Why don't you think it got as much attention by the American public in the moment, and it's now taking until now for us to recognize it?
Well, certainly it was covered heavily. It was on the front pages of all major newspapers. There was a 225 square foot viewing screen set up in Grand Central Terminal in New York, so people on their way to and from work could follow the mission. So certainly NASA made itself available, and certainly the media picked up on it. But Americans have a flickering attention span, and if you're not selling a story of the first men to go into space. The first Americans were Al Shepard, Gus Grissom, John Glenn, the first Americans to go to space at all, the first Americans to orbit the Earth. If you're not selling the first men, and you're not selling the first mission to another world, which is what happened with Apollo, people start to lose the thread of the story a little bit. Gemini was, in some ways, a promise of bigger things. When the missions were being flown, NASA sort of had to explain, this is why we are practicing these skills, and they will be put to even bigger use in Apollo. But that's not, a front page story for a lot of people. And in addition, Gemini was a victim of its own success. They flew 10 flights in 20 months, which meant they were launching a crew every 8 to 10 weeks. And it's a little bit like the space station. We forget the fact that people have been aloft aboard the space station continuously for 25 years. We sort of lost track of the shuttles. There were 135 missions. The only time they got major attention was on the 2 tragedies, which was Challenger and Columbia. So I think Gemini suffered a little bit also from that overexposure.
What do you want folks to take away from this book?
I would like people to take away a respect for the engineering, a respect for the intrepid nature of the astronauts, and a respect for the focus that it took the U.S. to achieve this program and the space program as a whole. From Mercury through Apollo, we spanned 4 presidencies, and yet the U.S. remained monomaniacally focused on getting to the moon. So whether it was Eisenhower, Kennedy, Johnson, or Nixon in the Oval Office, we still remained committed to getting to the moon. Whether it was the 88th Congress or the 89th Congress or the 90th or the 91st, lawmakers still said we are going to fund this project. The budget for NASA in 1965, its peak year of funding, was about $6.5 million, which is the equivalent of $58 billion now, which is 2.5 times what NASA is currently budgeted at. The space program made up 4% of the federal budget as opposed to 0.4% now. So the U.S. decided in 1961 to get to the moon, stuck with it for 11 years, and landed on the moon 6 times. And I think Gemini, I want people to take away the idea that Gemini was the middle piece of that wall, and without it, we never would have gotten to the moon.
Jeffrey Kluger is the editor-at-large with Time Magazine and author of the book Gemini, Stepping Stone to the Moon, The Untold Story. Jeffrey, thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you so much for having me.
That's going to do it for this week's show. If you're not already, be sure to subscribe to the show's podcast feed so you never miss an episode. Do that on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, really wherever you get your podcasts. Stay connected with the show. Be sure to follow us on social media. You can find us on Instagram and Facebook. We're at AWTY Space. If you got an idea for a future episode of this show, or you want to join us as a guest, reach out. We're at arewethereyet@cfpublic.org. Are We There Yet is a production of Central Florida Public Media. Our intern is Orion Boone. Our producer is Marion Summerall. Editorial guidance comes from LaToya Dennis. Support for Are We There Yet comes from our listeners. Until next week, I'm Brendan Byrne. Thanks for listening.